Not yet had Romulus traced the walls of the Eternal City. The city of Rome, thousands of years after the disintegration of its empire, is still upheld as the pinnacle of civilization. But what was life really like for the people of the so-called Eternal City? Join me in today's video where we will be exploring the lives of all the inhabitants of Rome, not just those at the height of Roman society. So, let us capture the vibrancy and layers of a city that stood at the centre of the ancient world. The essentials remain the same for the majority of people. Vegetables, pulses, cheese, eggs, fruit, olives, olive oil and wine. Cereals, especially wheat, above all was the dominant food group in the Roman diet, with it estimated to comprise up to 60% of it. The quality, variety and other aspects of the diet very much depended upon income. For instance, the poor of Rome could have only had access to pulses and some other animal produce like cheese and eggs to make up the protein of their diet. If you had slightly more money to spare, you might have had access to meat on some occasions. Fish could have been consumed too by middling Romans, but this was usually limited to preserved fish, crustaceans, freshwater fish or small marine fish, such as anchovies. Wealthier Romans, on the other hand, had access to a whole variety of proteins, including fresh fish such as sea bass or bream, mollusks, oysters, scallops, as well as various types of meat, such as beef, chicken, sheep, goat, pigs and birds, both poultry and game. Even the way that grain was consumed was indicative of wealth. Bread was the most popular way, and certainly the most aspirational, which is evident from the various representations of bread that survive. But this was not the reality for the poorest of Romans, who did not have the means to bake bread or pay others to do it for them. Their grain was consumed mostly through it being added to their porridges, potages and stews. Laying at the heart of an empire which incorporated lands from northern Europe, the coast of Africa and Asia Minor, food for the Romans included a medley of ingredients, which all united to form a unique Roman palate. This palate utilised large amounts of honey, vinegar and garum, which was a fermented fish sauce. Herbs and spices came from across the empire, including oregano, coriander, cumin, lovage, rue, fennel, garlic, sorrel and pepper, just to name a few. But when we are really trying to understand the lives of the Roman people in the capital, we must look at food beyond simple substance and diet. In Rome, food was very much a social practice, which enabled wider occurrences such as politics, business and interpersonal connections. Perhaps the most obvious way that we can view this transpiring is by viewing food as a display used by elites to highlight their power and wealth. An example of this is the use of the herb silphium, which was used by elite, which was in particular demand for elites given its rarity, only grown in modern-day Libya. The overall image that we have of Roman food as exotic and extravagant is very much informed by the recording of elite consumption, particularly on occasions such as banquets. These are recorded in texts such as Apicius, which was a Roman kind of cookbook. Some dishes recorded in here include fig-fed pork, gazelle, as well as stuffed dormice, which is stuffed with the foremeat of pork and small pieces of dormouse meat trimmings, all pounded with pepper, nuts, laser broth. Put the dormice thus stuffed in earthen casserole. Roast it in the oven or boil it in the stock pot. Another interesting recipe is white sauce for dainty food, which instructions include: take cumin, lovage, rue seed, plums from Damascus, soak in wine, add honey mead and vinegar, thyme and oregano to taste. For ordinary people, food was equally a social occasion, with meals consumed in public places due to the lack of kitchen space in urban dwellings. Food was consumed in a variety of places, such as taberna, which can be likened to a kind of fast food stall, which served food to busy Romans. Food was also served in capanae and popina, which were the inns and taverns. These places, although born out of the necessity of eating, were spaces where ordinary people could meet to relax and socialise, with food accompanied by drinking, gambling and gossip. Furthermore, food impacted the ordinary social and political lives of the Roman people in the form of the annonia, in which imperial authorities distributed grain to the people of Rome in order to maintain their support. As Paul Erdkamp notes, the annonia was not just an administrative detail of the running of the capital, it was a core issue in the political functioning of the Roman Empire, which highlights how food underpinned wider social mechanisms in the imperial centre of Rome. Another important area of life to understand when examining the lives of the inhabitants of imperial Rome is clothing. This is because it allows us to attempt to visualize the people who we are discussing. When we think of Romans, we think of togas. However, these would have only been worn for display purposes for elites during festivals, public holidays, and other such occasions. For most people, tunics would have been the garment of choice, made out of wool or linen. These were usually made from a long rectangle of fabric, which would have been pinned and belted for shape. These came in a variety of colours, from more neutral tones like white to brighter shades like red, green and blue. These tunics would have not been worn with trousers, since this was associated with barbarism in the Roman period. Other items of clothing which were commonly worn included cloaks, mantles, as well as sandals which were made out of soft leather. Sometimes these shoes had hobnails on the soles for extra grip for people who had manual labour jobs. Clothing was very much subject to and used to display class and wealth. For example, wealthy Romans sometimes used imported fabrics such as silk and cotton as alternatives to the usual wool and linen. Some elites also used fabrics with silver and golden threads weaved within them. Certain colours and clothing styles also denoted certain statuses. Togas with purple stripes, for instance, were used to highlight the position of a senator or other officials. Furthermore, clothing had gendered elements, as Kelly Olson notes, with the woman's clothing used as a visual indication of her rank, status and morality. Married women, for example, wore the stola, which was a tunic-like dress usually coming down to the ankle, as well as a mantle which was used to cover the hair in public, whereas women who were deemed to be adulteresses or sex workers wore a kind of toga as a marker of their lower status. Women also undertook certain processes to maintain beauty standards. Face creams contained ingredients such as white lead and chalk in order to give the impression of lighter skin. Makeup was also used to redden the cheeks. Coloured pigments and kohl were also used on the eyes. No matter a Roman status, however, maintaining appearance was at the heart of Roman life, with the city full of barbers and hairdressers, for example, who took on tasks like shaving, cutting, styling hair, and making wigs for their customers. At the centre of this process, however, was the bathhouse, which offered Romans a place to maintain a level of hygiene. Those who used baths would go through a cycle of bathing, which would increase in temperature, starting off in cold baths and then in the hot pools. The Romans did not use soap, but instead utilised olive oil and a strigil, which was a metal curved blunted blade, which scraped off the dead skin and sweat. Bathhouses alongside this also offered other treatments, such as massages and hair removal. They often had gymnasiums too, which made them somewhat like modern wellness centres. At its imperial height, the city of Rome had around 1 million inhabitants. The question arises, how did a pre-modern city deal with such a large population? One way that this happened was through the creation of large infrastructure networks. Roads, aqueducts and sewers were all built on a large scale. This happened alongside administrative organisation, which allowed the Romans to deal with the problems that arose from such a large population. Prefect of vigils, for example, was used in order to act as both a kind of police force and a fire response unit. On a smaller scale, as with anything, people's living situations very much depended upon their income. For upper-class Romans, the dwellings of choice were larger complexes, known as domus, which had multiple rooms used for different facets of family life. For example, there was a dining room which was known as a triclinium. Domuses were the height of luxury. They had decorated atriums, gardens, as well as hypocausts, which were an underfloor heating system in which hot air was produced by fires in order to heat the house. Some domuses even had their own private baths, which allowed elites to bathe in the comfort of their own homes. Some examples of domus do survive in Rome, such as remains found in Santi Sergo e Bacco church, and of course the imperial residences on Palatine Hill. However, the best preserved examples are outside of Rome, in Pompeii. In contrast, those of lower economic means lived in insula, which were essentially tower apartment blocks with multiple households living in the same building. These buildings tended to be owned by wealthy elites, who rented them out to lower classes. The quality and size of a unit of an insula would depend upon what a person could afford. Most typically, the lower levels of the insula had better conditions, with access to pumped water, more space, and sometimes even balconies. For the inhabitants of higher levels of insula, living tended to be cramped, with poor lighting and with no access to water directly in their homes. Overall conditions in insula tended to be much poorer than the living conditions of the elite, with house fires and collapsing buildings a risk which many Romans faced. It was also common in insula not to have bathing, washing or cooking facilities, which meant that people had to do more in public spaces, at bathhouses or food establishments which I discussed earlier, alongside giving their laundry to professionals called fullers. Another major aspect of Roman life was the various forms of entertainment which the people of Rome had access to. Singers, musicians and dancers could perform at banquets as well as on the street. Theatres were also another popular type of entertainment in Rome, as can be seen from the various theatres that survive, such as the Theatre of Marcellus. This was another popular form of entertainment in Rome, with chariot racing, beast hunts and gladiatorial games popular forms of public entertainment. These events offered the imperial authorities an opportunity to utilise public sporting events for political purposes, in the so-called bread and circus approach that Juvenal coined in his satires. Everyday life in the Roman capital was very much underpinned by the status hierarchy of the imperial world. Birth and wealth were key determining factors in the path one would follow in life. At the top of Roman society were the patricians, who can be defined as the land-owning families, whose power stemmed back to the days of the Republic. Their wealth and noble status allowed patricians to dominate both the economy and politics, with many serving as senators, for example. Below those who served as senators were the property owners who were known as equestrians. The title originally began for members of the imperial cavalry. However, it came to be a key administrative title. The children of these classes had access to greater levels of education, either attending schools or having personal tutors. Next in the social order came the so-called plebeians, or plebs, who were the free people who held citizenship. There is not one hegemonic profile for Roman plebs, since they made up the majority of Rome's urban population, meaning their jobs could range from artisans, shopkeepers, to bakers, soldiers, or manual labourers. The list was endless. Their children usually learnt via apprenticeships. The matter of citizenship possession ultimately was also a matter of status, with non-citizens ranking below the plebeians. Those who tended to be of this class were those who had emigrated to the city from elsewhere in the empire. Freed slaves also had an ambiguous social standing. They were no longer seen as property. they also were incapable of accessing full citizenship. At the very bottom of Rome's society were social outcasts, beggars, criminals, sex workers, entertainers, bandits, as well as the enslaved. Enslaved people's circumstances very much differed depending on their skill, closeness to their masters, and their given jobs. For example, slaves could be used for manual labour or for household maintenance, but they could also be used for highly skilled positions such as tutors, spinners, or scribes. But what did not differ in Roman slavery was a person's lack of legal status, with slaves subject to the will of their masters and unable to seek legal protection. Women had a very similar status in Roman society. Women in a legal sense had very little power. They were unable to directly participate in politics, for example, and were often married off at a very young age, sometimes as young as 12. Women's domain was deemed to be the home, and Roman ideals celebrated women's piety, obedience, and passiveness. But this was not always the case. Women did participate in business and could subtly influence politics, as is clear from figures such as Livia Drusilla and Agrippina the Younger. Daily life in Rome overall was very much determined by wealth. If you had the income, your life could match the advanced and opulent image that we have of the Romans, with grand houses, hypercourts, and banquets of food. However, we must keep in mind that this luxury was not the case for everybody, with many Romans living a life that did not measure up to the luxury. It is also important to consider that this luxury would have not been possible in the first place without the underclass of slaves, whose labour allowed for the comfort of their masters. Although we might imagine that the hierarchy of Roman society remained completely rigid, we must remember that it remained malleable. Wealth could be lost and made, the enslaved could be freed. Above all, those who are deemed lower in the hierarchy of Roman society, such as the enslaved and women, could exert control over their own lives. Hi there, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. I also have an Instagram and a TikTok page which I have linked below. Again, thank you so much for watching. I have been Our Historia, and until next time.